Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, usually on Tuesdays or Wednesday nights, and it's also uploaded as a YouTube video on the YouTube channel of Zenitsu, as well as being on various podcasting platforms like Spotify for your viewing and listening pleasure, usually uploaded around Thursday morning. So please feel free to do all of the social media stuff, leave a rating, like, follow, subscribe, and review, depending on the platform that you're listening on. It really does help a bunch. Today, I am back with Team Blank, well, more specifically, Headless from Team Blank, and today we are going to be talking, obviously, about the massive influx of metadata that we have for EX6 and BT16, as well as talk about the main topic, which is going to be about removal and protection, and how the game has evolved and changed, and our perceptions of removal and protection also have an impact on the game as well. But before we get into all that, first we have a question of the week, and, well, what is your favorite type of removal? So, if you want to talk about what kind of cards you like to use to make sure the opponent's Digimon don't stick around, it would be interesting to hear what you actually enjoy.
Right. So I think that the best form of removal is probably like removal into the security stack. I think that's the strongest one because we don't have very many protections for it, but my actual favorite would have to be deck bottom. Like bottoming things to the bottom of the deck, I think is just so funny. Because not only does that give you information, but it also just like I think hurts the soul of your opponent when you force them to bottom deck something. And just knowing that, even with how fast our decks are nowadays, that, like, a lot of times you're not really ever going to see that card ever again.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty strong. My favorite type of removal is probably just bouncing to hand. I'm not like a huge blue like Magic the Gathering player, so like I always found bouncing to be annoying, but ever since I have been playing a metric butt ton of blue in Digimon, I really value and respect just what bouncing to hand can do. And kind of similar to what you were saying, there's not that many protections against it. It's just really unfortunate that deletion kind of just sucks now, and three
Yeah.
colors use deletion, and one of them
Hmm.
doesn't really have a good soft removal to kind of back it up, which is unfortunate. We'll get into that later, but yeah, bouncing things is definitely really annoying, and I find it to be fun. So, with that, feel free in the comments, chat, or viewers to tell us your favorite form of removal that you like to play around with. But we have a lot of metadata to go over. We have, what, 4 events? We have 2 store regionals, 1 big in-person regional, and then a European regional. What do you feel like starting with?
Mm, we should probably just get the smaller events out of the way first, and then we can, dive into the big boys.
All right. So the smallest of the small, that is going to be Power 9. Power 9 we only have top 8 for, so that's a little unfortunate that we only have top 8 instead of top 16, but this was the smallest event. Only 6 rounds at 38 players. Top 16. Oh, it's funny. We have top 16. Oh, no, this is top 8. I'm like, it says top 16. But they're lying. Risu just forgot to edit it to top 8. But yeah, so in top 8, we have 3 Demon Lords, 2 Magnamons, 1 Yellow Vaccine, 1 Numemon, 1 Rapidmon. First place goes to 7 Great Demon Lords, then Yellow Vaccine, then Numemon, then 7 Demon Lords. Rapidmon is in 5th, 6 is Magnamon X, then Demon Lords, then another Magnamon. So basically everything that was meta is kind of in this event. The only like new Forerunner, or not really new Forerunner, just a deck we don't see that much top is Terriermon, and it is exactly what you would expect. It is Terriermon with Cherubimon. Shocker, right? Uh, the only real surprise that this deck list has is the Kenan Davis, but it's not that big of a surprise considering it's the BT8 one, where it's just interacting with two-color Digimon. So you at least get a gain of memory because you're playing with green Digimon, so it's at the start of your main, gain 1 memory, which isn't bad. And then when you Digivolve into a 2 or more color Digimon, you get to unsuspend you get to suspend the tamer to unsuspend that Digimon. So that way, if you're doing like the classic blue things and you're trying to aggro with your level 4s and you armor purge, you could re-Digivolve, unsuspend, or just do the same thing with level 5s and 6s as well. Just try to aggro if your Digimon lives, then you could just unsuspend for free just for Digivolving, which you were going to do anyway. Outside of that, nothing really special. But yeah, it's definitely a fun deck. On the slower side, but can still do very well.
Once you get enough tamers set up, though, like, all of your evos are basically for free. The only guy that costs anything is True BA, so there's that. But yeah, for the most part, you know, I played against this sort of deck, and I think that it's a decent meta call, because we do see that Mirage is back on the rise, like, with the Biomon that it gets, like, kind of gives that deck a little bit more life. You know, even though the deck is now like what, 5 sets removed?
Yeah, we've been playing around with Mirage in a full competitive manner for a year. Like, actually a full year. You could kind of say he existed a little bit from BT11 and EX4, but not to the true burst capacity that was BT13. And yeah, the deck is still viable. It's still one of the best 6 decks in the game, and yeah, it just has a real hard time with rabbits because you can't bounce the level 5, which is what the deck wants, and they have 2 aces that just absolutely ruin you, and you have blocker, so they're forced to attack with their level 5 to get unblockable, but they can't. So yeah, it's just a rough day for Mirage when you see rabbits.
Yeah, so in my regional run, I was at Riverside. I ended up running into 2 rabbits of all things while playing a Mirage top end. So,
Yeah.
fun times.
But shifting gears over to Magic Strongholds, we see, again, more of the top 6 decks being represented. I think at least one of all the top 6 decks are being represented here. This time, it was probably still about 6 rounds. It's 56 players this time, a little bit bigger, and we have top 16 data for. We also have the archetype breakdown if you're curious. We're not going to go too deep into that. There was just a lot of Imperial in this event, and obviously, with a lot of players playing a specific deck, there's a high chance you're going to see it. So there was 9 Numemon in this event and 11 Imperial, and as such in top 16, about half of both made it into top 16. So you have 5 Numemon, 5 Imperial, 1 Yellow Vaccine, 1 Magnamon X, 1 Tyrant, 1 Aegis, 1 Mirage, 1 7 Great Demon Lord. So if anyone's curious, I'll just say it again. The top 6 decks are Numemon, Imperial, Yellow Vaccine, Magnamon, Mirage, and 7 Great Demon Lord. So this event literally had at least one of all of the top 6 decks top. And then we had Tyrant and Aegis as the extras. So nothing really special about any of these lists except for Aegis-Dramon, because absolutely nobody was expecting this deck to even be a thing. So, I'm going to show the deck list real quick, and we could kind of discuss it. So, you were mentioning, you heard some comments, or read some comments, and heard from the whispers of the grapevine, that there was some misinformation going on, and the player might not have actually known how to play their deck.
So, I didn't watch the video or that had the interview, but I was reading some comments on like another Discord chat that I'm a part of, and from what they were saying, it seemed like this player was insinuating that like certain targets were valid targets for parts of the effects. So I believe they mentioned like being able to play out like Zudomon from like Zhang Pen and stuff like that, as well as like a couple other of the little guys. But unfortunately, none of the like level 3s are valid targets for Shangpen because they lack the Aqua trait. So it really only plays out like 4s and 5s in the deck that aren't the Zudomon. But and Seadramon's about the Aegistramon's about the same. It can only target the Aqua Sea Beast traits, but it can also do any Seadramon name that's in its sources. So
Yeah. Like, I like Aegistramon, don't get me wrong, and I like what Seadramon and Metal Seadramon and stuff do. It's just, when a player gets a top like that, even though this is a smaller event, it kind of just does seem weird that they're saying that misinformation, which insinuates that they literally have been misplaying, and there wasn't a judge called them out on it. So, like, I don't know. Like, I think Zhang Pen's a good card. Yeah, I think Zhang Pen's a great card. It's just, right now, I think the pieces that he's playing with isn't exactly 100% there to be super meta competitive. But I think, like, he's got a lot of good stuff going for him, and with some more support, which he might get in, like, what, EX8?
Possibly. Like, there's the chance, but I don't know that what do we know about EX8 right now?
We just know some Digimon and themes, and Metal Seadramon is going to be in there.
Yeah, so there's the possibility, right, with Metal Seadramon, but the problem, of course, becomes that Metal Seadramon now has 2 archetypes that it could possibly support. It could randomly be Dark Master support.
I don't think it's going to be Dark Master support because it's standalone. I would hope not
either, but yeah.
But they could just randomly slap on Dark Master's tag just because. It would be a level 6, ideally with an on-play effect that plays with Aegistramon still. So it's entirely possible they could do the whole support both.
I do agree, though, that I think that every time that they print those characters now, they should have the Dark Master's trait, even if they're not that iteration of the character. I think it would be healthy for, like, that archetype in general. But I think it's very telling that if you look at the deck list for Aegistramon, all of the new EX6 pieces made it in as 4-ofs. Just goes to show you that the card quality just isn't there for, like, the rest of the pieces.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and the deck also doesn't have any dedicated tamers, which is why it's higher on the mental trainings and memory boost, because that's basically acting as your tamer, which is fine. Again, I like a lot of the ideas that are in here. It's very close to what I was kind of like. I showed off on YouTube. Obviously, I wasn't playing Plesio and I wasn't playing Aegis. Instead, I was electing for Jumbo Gamemon, just because he's another way to actively spit Digimon out to be able to get there on plays. So, like, if this player was using Jumbo Gamemon, then Zudo Ace would be a valid target for something to spit out, because Jumbo Gamemon is just generic. He doesn't care what he's spitting out, as long as it's I think it's as long as he's blue. But again, they were doing Plesio Aegis. But
Plesio, I think, cool, but, like, really it's cool when you can absorb it into something else and then get the actual inheritable, but sometimes that's hard to do. So, like, in my version of this deck, I still am not playing Aegistramon, and I moved away from Plesiomon, because I found that, like, a lot of the times you can leave a 5 on board, so I decided that Vike was more threatening.
Yeah, even though Vike also isn't on, like, brand, it just doesn't matter. Yeah, because this deck doesn't really have, like, a search for sea, animal, or aquatic. Like, it just doesn't have it. It's color-based.
You just have generic draw, so...
Yeah. So, I like both of those ideas, and it's funny, both of them are both blue and black cards. But it shows, like, with the right type of a run, that even some of these lesser decks still can get lucky and still be able to top. And the only question is if this player actually did end up misplaying because he didn't understand the rules involved in their own deck. That would be kind of
very unfortunate. Yeah,
because it does sour the experience. It's like, oh, cool, this deck worked. And then it's just like, oh, but he didn't know what he was doing, so and nobody called him out on it, so he won it by proxy.
Yeah, which would be unfortunate because I do think it's cool to say that this deck did well. I do think Yang Pen is a very strong guy. Like you were talking about, you like bounce, and the fact that he can just do an entire board wipe bounce, like he can even force people to pick up level 7s, is very funny.
Oh
You
yeah,
just have to
like
have the bodies to do it.
Zhang Pen's a card I always like was dreaming of on wanting to play around with, but unfortunately, like the support just wasn't there for me to feel comfortable with actually saying I believe in this deck competitively. Because right now, the current state of the Digimon market, unfortunately, is making it so there's zero reason for me as a competitive player to even think about playing casually because I'm spending the same, if not more money to build casual decks than competitive ones. So when that happens, it's just like, why should I ever waste my time building a more casual deck, even though it's more of a for fun deck, when I could put that same amount of effort to build a more competitive deck?
Yeah, and I think sadly a lot of that comes by the fact that like Bandai's been really bad about printing good support for like casual decks. Like there's absolutely no reason that the Seedramon promo is an $18 card, and if you wanted to play this topping list, you need to buy 2 of it. So that's already like $36 you're out for a promo.
Right, and then like if you look at a deck like Mirage, just as an example, I think the most expensive card in Mirage is literally the BT11 version of Mirage itself. And if it's the same type of a price point, where it's just like, yeah, I buy a full playset of that for let's just say $60. That's probably being generous, but I buy a full playset of that for $60 and everything else is dirt cheap. I could build that deck for 80 and I could build like this deck for 80. Which one would I rather build? Like it doesn't make sense.
BT11 is an $8 card for base
Yeah,
rarity.
so literally for almost the same price, you could just build Mirage and have a more competitive deck. So
which is the problem I think that we're seeing a lot right now. Like it's the same for Diabora, where you need to have the ace, and the ace is a $25 card. Like I think luckily the Tyranno Ace like came down in price, but there was also that issue, like messing up Tyrannomon for like no good reason.
yeah. But as far as the actual top 16 for the Magic Stronghold, first place was Numemon. Second place was Yellow Vaccine. Third was Magnamon X. Fourth was Tyrant. Fifth was Numemon. Sixth was the Aegistramon. So I think because this was a store regional, it only went to top 4 was invites, if I recall. So Aegistramon still didn't get the invite.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Then 7th place was Numemon. 8th place was Mirage, 9th place was Numemon, 10th place was Demon Lords, 11th Imperial, 12th Imperial, 13th Imperial, 14th Numemon, 15th Imperial, and 16th Imperial. So a lot of Imperials, and a lot of Numemons.
And I think Imperial, again, is a pretty good call, because it, again, preys on blue.
Oh, yeah, like, if they're trying to use, like, if you get up into the BT16 Imperial Dramon Dragon mode, and you have a fighter mode in hand, ace or not, like, that ability to just hose on what the opponent is trying to do is absolutely insanely huge. For both playing Digimon by card effects, which is a lot of effects, and Digivolving by card effects, which is also still a lot of effects.
Yeah.
And Imperial, he's a deck that he's working with so many tools that, like, once he gets going, he's really hard to stop. Like, really hard.
Yeah, and I'm not looking right now at some of those topping lists, but there's a lot of interesting pieces that Imperial can be afforded. Like, you can run the Wormmon armor that, like, lets you just beat Magnamon.
Yeah.
I have a good.
Hey, Guardian.
I'm late as shit because I ain't feeling so hot, so...
Ah, you're good.
But it looks like the highest placed Imperial is not messing with any of that technology, so a little sad to see.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes going for what's known and what's great is never a bad thing.
They're on with single fighter mode BT12 though, which, you know, is not in every list, so that's kind of fun.
Yeah. Then moving on to Core TCG Riverside. So you guys were actually at that event. I'm not gonna
That's
ask
great.
you. Yeah, I'm not gonna ask you how you did unless you really want to share. Just
Screw Machine Dramon, all I gotta say.
this Machine Dramon is a pretty good deck, especially right now because of the topic of protection and removal, and Machine Dramon has really good access at both. But as far as Riverside, this was a big in-person regional, 305 players, a full 9 rounds of Swiss, best of 3, and there was no actual undefeated at the end, so that's always fun. Thanks Bandai for that
Yep.
rule.
Yep, the new rule.
So I don't hate it. It's just I'm not in love with it either. Just because like it does give the actual ability for X and 2 to get into top slots, whereas before X and 2 was not good enough. Like it
Wait,
actually
seriously?
was. Yes, if you actually like go
I could
back.
have kept going.
Yeah, so if you look at like all of the past data, you could see that before Bandai started implementing that rule, X and 2 was not good enough to get into top 16, but now because of their rule, it actually creates the opportunity for X and 2 to make it into top slots. Half of what Riverside did was X and 2. It's because it forces that much more games, so X and 2 is still in contention. But rules aside, we don't have the full archetype breakdown because this was a larger event, and Core probably just didn't want to share that, or they just didn't put it together because that was just a lot of decks to look at and categorize. But as far as the top 16 breakdown, we have 5 Numemon, 2 Mirage, or 2 Magnamon X, 2 Yellow Vaccine, 2 Imperial, 1 Mirage, 1 Phoenixmon, 1 Rapid, 1 Demon Lord, and 1 Fenry. So Fenry finally makes a reappearance after being completely absent for the first half, if not first 3/4 of EX6. So it's nice to see him come back in some capacity. As well as
To be
Phoenix.
fair, he dodged all the Imperials, which would have screwed him over.
I don't think it's that bad. It's not great, but it's not like the worst because with Alliance you can hit over the 16 to 18k.
I'm talking about the fact that he has to use his own effect, which triggers the freaking 16 dragon mode to just go, okay, I'm gonna get rid of you now.
Oh yeah, that yeah. I mean, if you go fast enough as Fen, you could kind of ignore it, but yeah, like it can be a pretty hard matchup, which is why Imperial's like one of the better decks because of that card, just being able to shut other people down. As far as what won the event, that goes to Mirage. So kudos to the Mirage player getting all the way up into top slots and winning it. Then second place was Magnamon X. Third place was actually Phoenix with some bird action. Fourth,
Yeah,
and
it's a
fifth,
very interesting list, that Phoenix list.
yeah, we could take a look at it in a second. Fourth and fifth were Numemon. Sixth was Yellow Vaccine. Seventh, we see Rapidmon X again. Probably because a lot of like blue and people think that Numemon gets eaten live by it. It doesn't. It doesn't.
Does.
It doesn't. It doesn't. Like you could play around it if you're a good Numemon player. Then we have in 8th Numemon, 9th Demon Lords, 10th Magnamon X, 11th was Fen, then 12th was Numemon, 13th was Imperial, 14th Imperial, 15th Yellow Vaccine, and 16th Numemon. So that's a lot of Numemon. That's all I can say. Between all of these events, it's still a lot of Numemon, but that's to be expected. So as far as Phoenixmon goes, you are the resident bird expert. So what do you think about this Phoenix list?
So they play 2 Valcase. I'm only on 1, mainly because it's less searchable than most of your other targets. It's only really searchable by your Biomon, and the one piece of technology that the deck has is Garudamon X. Grabs back any red Digimon. So you can just pick back up Valks, and the deck does leave like 5s on the board pretty regularly. The thing that I was noticing is they're very lean on their numbers. So they're only playing a total of 5 level 4s in the deck.
Yeah, that's
Which,
super skimpy.
yeah, which, like, you can afford to do in this deck. I'm already on, like, a much lower count than normal, but I'm not on 5 level 4s. And that did afford them, like, the ability to play a lot of things. Like, so I had to make the decision between Crimson Blaze and Trident Gaia. I think both are great cards. I felt like Crimson Blaze was better into the meta because, as we see, like, Nuamon's a very big portion of the meta. So it hosing that is better than, needing Trident Gaia for, like, Magna. I did up my counts for Garudamon Ace to make up for that, so that I could deal with Magnamon. But, you know, the main thing that's interesting here is their Cool Boy. So Cool Boy realistically has 3 targets. It grabs Garudamon X, it grabs Phoenixmon X, and it grabs Protoform. And there's some value here because a lot of what this deck kind of wants to do is establish a Garudamon for practically free, and then give it Rush with X. And so getting a memory and an extra draw in that like little cycle is not bad at all. I think the big problem though is that I still wouldn't recommend playing Cool Boy, mainly because there's just not an X in the level 4s. If there was a level 4 X or even a level 3 X, I think Cool Boy definitely would have a place in the deck. But the fact that it doesn't help you grab any of your level 4s, and that is your, like, smallest line, means that you're kind of banking on finding a good 5 and being able to, like, establish a board. Like, it just, to me, seems like this deck is a little too high-rolly for a deck that's already kind of high-rolly as, like, a funny OTK deck.
Yeah, because you have the BT11 Biomon and BT15 Biomon, as well as the Akiho as the other ways to grab your level 4s from the deck. And ideally, it seems like they just want a level 4 in their trash, so that way they can kind of just reuse the same one over and over again.
Yeah, which is probably the hope, is just find one and be good for the game. But, like, sometimes you just don't, like, find that. So, just, I guess, kudos to them for, the good luck with the draws.
Yeah, because it was it's the same type of philosophy and ideology that my local Ragna player he is under, where he is literally strictly just running all of the new EX6 cards and borderline none of the others, because he's just like, well, I don't need the extra level 4s because if I see 1 or 2, I just reuse it over and over again because he's playing the Black Egg, which grabs a card from your inheritables. So it's just like, yeah, I just grab it back and then boom, I have a level 4. So yeah, that was his idea on why he is comfortable running a lower level 4 count.
And all common sense and metadata does show that the Black Egg is the way to go. The Red Egg is not the wave.
Right. But outside of that, it just looks like birds to me, and birds can do some really strong things just because Garudamon X is an absolute beast of a card. And the whole, like, Christie combo is pretty silly and fun, too. It makes me want to try birds, but again, the need for the protoform is like, if I'm putting this much effort into birds, I think of what other decks I could use protoform in. Numemon. But
in fairness, you can get away with the normal X. Like, that's what I had been using a couple times.
Oh, just because you could swing and then...
Yeah.
Okay.
Because so you still trigger Phoenixmon X. Like, realistically, protoform is only really good at the Garudamon stage. But this deck's not even running that many 4s, so, like, realistically, the protoform doesn't do too much. Like...
Yeah, I think it's just there to just have, if you, like, get a Garudamon on the field that doesn't have Rush. Oh, wait, no, I'm being stupid. Garudamon X can just Digivolve for 0. Yeah. So, like...
on top of a Garudamon and get Rush, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's maybe just a recycling tool where it's just like, okay, my stack is gonna die. Cool, I get to grab something back.
The only other, like, spot where it's any good is to not have a Phoenixmon. And I think that's what allows you to play, like, ratios where we're only running, like, 3 of it.
Right.
Like, which is the same way that, like, I'm playing it too right now, is only running 3 of the Phoenixmon BT15. Sadly, 11 just doesn't make the cut anymore, but, it allows for that, but in all honesty, like, Phoenix Mon X has Blitz, so, like, a lot of the times it doesn't really matter, and you'll get your on-deletes, and a lot of the times you can either get back the one or so memory that you need to keep turn and then just kind of go off, but I digress. Like, you in theory can just play the old X, and it'll do just about the same. Like, the thing that also makes it kind of cool is that you can put it down at any point. So, like, you can put it into a Bergermon to go into a Garudamon X and then become a Phoenix Mon X while attacking. So, like, that's all still fair game. Whereas, like, Protoform is a little bit more restrictive.
Yeah, but they obviously have better results than either of us. So, I mean, I didn't even past simulator and initial testing. I didn't actually physically put birds in paper.
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly think, like, realistically, you should be on birds. Like, to be honest, out of the decks that you're interested in, I think you should really be on birds.
I mean, I'll probably...
What deck do you think I should be on, Zan?
I don't know.
You should probably just play Demon Lords.
Probably. My brother's having an absolute blast with Demon Lords, and his Demon Lord deck isn't, like, fully put together, and he's able to at least compete relatively competently with a lot of the other guys at locals, and they're slightly more experienced than he is. So...
Well, we're almost done putting ours together. We need maybe one more Lucemon.
Yeah.
Maybe. That's if we want to run 4. You know?
It's an interesting one. Like, it's kind of slower than the other demons, so I don't know how necessary it is to run the full grip of it.
Right now, my brother's running 3, but the new Lucemon is actually a really good card. Like, he's really
it's one of the best
good.
cards in the entire thing. Because as long as you have a Lucemon in trash, which is almost always, you could just be like, oh, look, I'm going to get absorbed, but I'm going to spit out another one that's just going to fuck your shit up.
Yeah.
Well, you have to have that, and he's the slowest because he doesn't have the rest of the family effect, where when he's supposed to go, he gives you another source for gate. So him being level 5 and not having that effect makes him very slow, where if you have to start him or, like, anything else, like, he's bad. Like,
yeah, he's definitely better in the late game rather than the early game.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Where... And
it's why once we hang out on next Thursday,
on a lower count.
When we hang out next Thursday, Poncho, I'm gonna have Nikki hand me all the demon stuff, and I'm gonna throw that together. Later, the ramp cards are what's gonna be the primary source of that. Considering this meta has a lot of sources that need to be stripped off. So I'm probably gonna be upping the Levia.
Yeah. It kind of, you just need to play around with your control tools, because the deck has some surprising levels of resilience that, like, good players can really exploit, where it's just like, oh, you think you're in a good position? Well, JK, I'm just going to play a couple of cards and then turn the whole thing around. And that's the crazy potential of Demon Lords, and the fact that it gets better in EX7 with Shoto, just because now all your Demon Lords have blocker, is absolutely crazy.
Yeah, not just your.
I thought
your
you only gave one blocker.
Well, I mean,
you give it to the one guy you played. So.
Yeah, you're only playing one at a time, so yeah, he gives one Digimon blocker, but yeah.
I mean, if you get more Shotos, you can get more blockers on other guys if you play the other guys, but yeah. So, in my run at Riverside, I ran into demons first, I ran into 2 bunnies afterwards, and then I just had to kind of call it. So I was, at that point, I had lost to demons, mainly because I was playing Mirage, and they just emptied their hands so easily. In Game 1, I got put under 3 Digimon Emperors, and got Ruin Moded 4 turns in a row. And that just gave them enough time to eventually Agudamon me, so not much I can do about that. In the second game, I went into Burst Mode twice, but it only got, like, 2 swings. Because I couldn't get anything else, or it ever only got 1 swing, because they just emptied their hands so efficiently once they knew what I was playing. Which is disappointing. I tied a rabbits because in turns I had to assume that they had the Mokgao in hand, so I couldn't go for like anything else other than a, other than a normal play, and they just didn't have the cards in hand again. So unfortunate. And then I lost to rabbits again to Mokgalgamon, just being a brick house and turning off my boss monster.
Yeah, that happens.
So I just got the little bit of the unlucky run where a deck that doesn't care about its hand size and has very effective tools to empty it out, right? With like Belfie being able to like just pitch cards just to pitch cards in that matchup, and rabbits just being a natural counter to blue top megas.
Yeah, especially if they're sitting on a floodgate, then you just can't gain memory, and there goes a lot of your low end.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah,
but yeah,
an unfortunate run.
how'd you do, Guardian?
Not great.
You don't have to
Literally,
say if you don't want to.
First game, ran into Machindra. He beat the hell out of me before I could even do anything, and just sat on a freaking analog. Second game, Imperial, it was neck and neck. Only reason I lost that one was because of my own little screw up. I literally forced him to draw a card to make sure he had 9, and the card he drew happened to be the ace.
Yeah, that's the other thing is right now, Mirage and putting cards in their hand like is a little worrisome for some of these very strong aces that now exist, like Fighter and like Ragna.
Mm-hmm. Game 3, again, Machine. Just did not want to deal with it. Got freaking raked again. Game 4, Machine. It's just like I ran into every Machine player that was there. I was like, Jesus.
That's funny. And then we have one last event to go over before we actually get into the real topic. There was just a lot that happened this past weekend.
Yeah.
So it was the Barcelona European Regionals. This had 107 players. That would have been like, what, 7 rounds of Swiss. And the top 16 archetype breakdown is as follows: 6 Numemon, 3 Armor Vaccine or Yellow Vaccine, 2 7 Great Demon Lords, 1 Ragda Lordmon, 1 Magnamon X Antibody, 1 Mirage, 1 Imperial, and hey, there's Fenrir Lugamon again. So the big highlight of this event was the first place winner, which was Ragda Lordmon. We'll go over that list in a minute. Then second and third is Numemon, fourth was Magnamon, fifth was Armor Vaccine, sixth was Demon Lords, 7th and 8th were both Numemon, 9th was Armor Vaccine again, 10th was Demon Lords again, 11th was Mirage, 12th and 13th were Numemon. Numemon seemed to be sticking together in this event. 14th was Imperial, 15th was Fen, and 16th was that Armor Vaccine again.
Sadly, the Numemon at this point must go under the hammer.
Well, that'll be a separate topic for probably a different time, because that'll eat up a lot of time going into that rabbit hole. And
So
I want to highlight the Ragna player, because we really haven't seen any Ragna success outside of literally this. I think there was a small event, maybe, like, where somebody showed off their, like, first place locals or whatever. That's not a huge success. 100 players, I'd say, is a little bit more substantial. But they are, shocker, playing mostly...
new pieces.
Yeah, new pieces. So the only old pieces is the BT3 Ludamon, because it's a dig 5 for Legend Arms and Ragna. So that's a lot to dig through, and finding Ragna is huge. And then Promo Zubamon, which is really unnecessary in this deck. I'm going to say that right now. It is very unnecessary. I understand why they're running it, is if they're in Briarwee Ludramon, then it's a way to give Briarwee Ludramon raid, but there's so much Raiden piercing in all of the red cards that it really seems unnecessary, and it's just a player playstyle choice. And if anyone wanted to actually like play this list minus the promo, just run the new Ludamon and you're good to go. Easy.
Yeah. So the main thing
I'm actually
with that
glad
promo,
that's actually going to be in the next event pack for Wave 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
no, it's a part, isn't it? Isn't it participation?
It's still Wave 3, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're guaranteed it. You get it just for playing.
Which is even
that's very
better.
different than it being in an event pack. In an event pack, you're not guaranteed it. Like, I've played in almost every regional this season, and I've gotten myself one sleep mode Belfamon.
Yeah.
And I've placed well enough to at least get like the extra pack every time. So I don't know.
Yeah, as far as the other old pieces they're running, starter deck, Ludo, which I'm on as well, so I don't fault anyone for choosing that one. And then they are also on the starter deck Braiwi Ludgermon, because I really do value his effect a little bit more than the old one. Just as a card to just sit around, it could spawn an extra body, it has some really good protections, its inheritables good. And then you have Ragnar Lordmon as the BT3 one, because you're just sitting on level 6s, and, well, even though he doesn't have protection the turn you go up into him, he's still a free Evo. And he rigs himself with whatever other inheritable you want. He has Security Attack Plus and Reboot, so he could still apply lots of pressure onto the opponent for basically nothing at all.
Yeah, since he EVOs for 3 and then gets 3 back if you put back in a Brywin or a Duranda.
Yeah, so with all of the Brywis and Durandas, it doesn't seem like it's that hard, considering Ragna Ace wants to DNA with it as well. So they're kind of fulfilling the same role. One's just more proactive, and the other one's just reactive.
I think
Would
they're
love to see a
coolest.
Mashimon in Wave 3, honestly. Even though it'll never happen.
Yeah, and then they're obviously on the Black Eggs, and then they're actually not running any of the Legend Arms option. That basically spits out a Legend Arms for getting removed from the field. Instead, they're just running Digimon Emperor and Laplace Demon as just another way to goad, so that way you could try to ace on the opponent's turn.
Pretty cool in the list. I get why Emperor's there, like, for where the meta's at, unfortunately. Like, and it's the same as, like, Demon Lords, where you kind of just need to stall, and once you get into your guy, like, you kind of just win the game, and that's always how Ragnar's been. Or, like, if you get into your boy, like, it's really hard to do anything, especially now with, like, the new, I can't remember his name right now, Raiji Ludamon, that gives protection.
Yeah, well, I think, like, a lot of decks can just DP reduce it. Like, Numemon could just DP reduce it to Oblivion if they have a wide enough field, and then...
Well, you'd have to let them get there, and, like, the deck has, like, Raid, so you should... And Piercing, so you should be, theoretically, like, clearing bodies every turn.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. I'm just saying it's, like, the only way out.
And your base already a very big stack, like... All of the Ragnars are, like, I think the old one is 14, the new one's a 15, and then your entire, like, red side gives you, like, 2k.
Inheritables.
On your turn,
and then you
or,
have
like,
the
floating
Zubamon.
DP, and the black side gives you DP on your opponent's turn, so, like, you tend to be very big most of the time. So, like, it is an uphill battle for them to, like, hit the numbers, like... Whereas, like, hitting 12 or 13 was perfectly fine, like, for Magna. But hitting the, like, 17, 19 pluses or whatever, like, can be hard sometimes.
Yeah, and then Raid just makes it so you could just kill, basically, their biggest thing, which ideally is their Megas, and it just makes it easier to start winning, because if they have their smaller stuff, then... they're going to have to waste effort and energy rebuilding, and that's something they don't have when they have a Ragna staring them in the face.
Yeah, and
it's even funnier if they decide to play the freaking old black stuff, which causes de-digivolve, so it'd just be like, okay, I'm going to knock you down a level, and then now I'm going to punch you in the face.
I've seen people in, like, I've seen Japanese lists use it. It's just, I think it's a little too hard to use because if that's your only level 4 that you see and you have only a red level 3, then you are actually just stuck. And even though, yes, that's a very small percentage chance, it's still just the worst feeling in the world. And in this list specifically, because they're running double pairs of Zubamon, that's more likely to be the case. So they actually can't run it. So, but I have seen decks use it with Digivolve just because they have access to that.
There's other pretty cool pieces that the deck could run. Like you could run that option card for Ultimate Chaosmon. So
the Ultimate
card.
Evolution.
Yeah, like it lets you do a DNA from hand with Mega level Digimon, which is already what this deck wants to do, but now you can just do it on your turn for 4. So that way you don't have to get that second Mega onto the board, like, anyway, which does help the deck a little bit. And in Security, it's not a bad effect either, because you can just pick back up an Ace, or the missing Mega that you needed in your hand, like, when it gets checked in Security. So, it's, like, a decent enough card, like, there's some merit to run it, but, like, this topping list is, it's a pretty clean list. Like, it just, doesn't have a lot of fluff in it, like, everything, for the most part, makes sense. Like, there's a couple spots where you could maybe make a couple changes here or there, but, like, for the most part into the meta, this is a perfectly fine list. Like, you can see why it did well.
Yeah. And I do think, like, this, again, isn't to, like, knock on any of the players using off decks that have done well in this event. I do think it is easier with a smaller play count for decks like this to generally do well, just because there's less of a field that they actually have to fight through in case there are just a specific, like, number of, like, decks that would be able to beat it out, or just bad matchups or whatnot. So it's easier in smaller events to see less bad matchups to have an easier run. Not saying that the player wasn't skilled, because they still had to face, like, 7-8 rounds of raw Swiss to get to first place for this. But it is just a statistical fact that the smaller the event, the easier it is for rogue decks to be able to win.
And I think Ragna's a good transition into what is supposed to be our main topic after all of this.
Yes. So that's all the metadata, and Ragnar Lordmon, what's making him so strong is his protection and removal. So that's, like, the big core concept, because I was sitting there and I was, like, flipping through my old videos and, like, some of my old hot takes, and I was just like, man, Digivolve really sucks. It's, like, the worst form of removal, and it's, like, the only thing that Black has going for it, unfortunately, which is why it's the terrible color. And now I'm sitting here, like, 3 years later, and I'm just like, man, Digivolve is, like, absolutely insane. And I'm just like, wait, what happened between then and now in order for me to have such a massive change in opinion? And that goes to just how removal and protection work, as well as deck ratios, and how just the game has fundamentally changed between the beginning and where we're at. So I think, like, obviously Magnamon X is a big contentious talking point, because Magnamon X is borderline defining and warping the entire meta. And I've said this before, and it might be my own hot take, or it just might be a general consensus at this point, but, like, if your deck isn't able to deal with Magnamon X, you're borderline not really playing Digimon at this point in terms of a competitive standpoint. Like, if you don't have an answer for that level of defense and protection that's just for free built into that Digimon, like, what are you actually doing? And that's why we see decks like Mirage actually do well, is because he actually has one of the best answers, and that's to not actually answer it, and that's just to go around it. And that's why we're going to see in, like, BT17 that Ancient Garurumon is basically in that hot seat too, because it has an answer for Magnamon X. And that's kind of where the meta is headed, is, like, you have to have an answer for Magnamon X, otherwise you're not really a deck, because his protection is just too good. And that's why, like, a deck like Numemon and various other yellow decks are doing well against Magnamon, is because their removal actually can deal with Magnamon, because it's a lingering effect. and Magnemon's protection is only temporary. A lot of these like really super stupid powerful levels of protection where it's like you just can't physically touch me at all for the turn that I'm played, those are really strong, but they're temporary, so anything that lingers is able to still attach itself and deal with potentially the card, which again is defining where we need the removal to be at in order for your deck to be labeled as competitive, which is what Numemon is doing right now. So, protection is always a very dangerous thing when it comes to trading card games, because if you have too much of it, it makes removal useless. If you have too little of it, it makes removal borderline god tier. And there's like a very fine line that you have to ride in order for it to not be completely and utterly meaningless. Like, I've played TCGs before where the protection levels were just so high, removal was borderline dead. Like, you just could not fundamentally run any kind of removal because it was a dead card because the protection was too great. I'm not saying Digimon is at that point yet, but the fact that a card like Magnemon X, to an extent, Ragna the turn you play him, like things that you just can't interact with, that's not good and healthy gameplay.
I think removal, though, has had, like, some issues. Like, in very recent history, like, if we go back to the BT14 meta, we see certain decks, like, being very, competitively viable in that meta, mainly because, like, removal effects on Digimon bodies, like, became so good that there was no reason to be running option-based removal. And so there was kind of a resurgence in OTK-style decks. Like, you see in BT14 that, like, Mirage is in a very good spot. Like, you see that Fenrir is, like, at the height of its power for the most part, right? Like, even though, like, looking back on it, it was a very fair deck compared to, like, later iterations of Purple.
I'm not going to deny that at all.
No, and like you compare where we currently are to like all the way back in BT, like the early stages of the game, we didn't have the same levels of removal on Digimon. So when Lord Nightmon came out and it was basically a mega that was able to check and answer other megas, and no other mega was able to check and answer Lord Nightmon, that's what put it in the hot seat. Is just that ability in of itself to remove the opponent's Digimon. And that's kind of where the game of chicken started to form, is like BT4 is when it kind of started, and then BT5 is when you needed to understand how that chicken dynamic works because of specific removal type of abilities.
And that's the thing that we've kind of been seeing, is that, like, removal on Digimon main bodies, like, has, like, exponentially, like, gotten kind of crazy. Like, we were talking about Shangpenmon earlier, and Shangpenmon can quite literally be an entire board wipe. If you had 3 bodies on the board, right? Which, you know, doesn't always happen, but, like, the fact that it itself, like, just on Evo can, you know, clear the entire board of Digimon, like, is fairly, like, wild. Like,
it's
to
not
where
just
we
on
had
Evo,
been.
it's on Play too, and when you combine it with Aegis, it's just like, wow, I just can't play. Because Aegis doesn't say play by a card effect. It says when your opponent plays a Digimon. So it means if you hard slam something, you're SOL.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, yeah, but Aegis itself... So, like, here's the catch-22. Aegis himself, because he's an older card, doesn't actually have any protections. So you just out the Aegis, and then they're SOL because they invested that much time and effort into it, which, again, is that feels bad situation. And that's why we are seeing more and more Digimon with more and more protections, to the point where you need to have at least some level of protection in, again, order to be considered somewhat meta viable, because, like, look at all of the DNA decks. They at least have partition to be able to keep their bodies around. A good portion, I mean, the good ones have partition.
Not the Blast guys. Like, the new Blast guys don't have it, but, like, all of the current
Master
DNA
needed
decks.
partition.
Yeah,
That's
but
what she needed.
yeah, Masty was trying to rely on Scapegoat and Barrier in order to have protections herself, which is significantly inferior to something like what Ragnar Lordmon's doing. And I granted, yes,
Or he's
Ragnar
building
Lordmon's a
different
level
shit.
7 and Mastymon's a level 6, but we have the partition for the level 5s, which granted the level 5s aren't aces. From BT16, so like you're seeing a lot of like gives and takes in terms of like trying to balance what these new types of cards are doing and
I think
what they're
inherently
allowed to
though,
do.
Mastimon was like left in a very bad position. Like, so Ragna has the thing where it's like, oh, it's harder to get a level 6 out. Sure, on paper, yes, but in this current like landscape, like it's really not that hard. And they handed you two new shiny tools to be like, oh, at any point, just like mill or trash a level 6, and then play the new option card, put it under like a level 3 Digimon, and at any point it dies, you can just be into a level 6 and you're golden, right? But the problem there is that like now you're 11k to 12k bodies that are level 6 and can't very well easily be removed, where Mastimon's like, oh, I'm gonna play a 6-costed 6k body that is level 5, which in the current landscape is everything removes that. There's like just about nothing that like is playable that doesn't hit that threshold.
Mm-hmm. She's also been
Yes.
getting the shaft for the longest portion, which is kind of, I don't know
Well,
how to say it right, but she's just been getting shafted.
I think it's fair though because of yellow. If she was not in the yellow color and allowed to like do security shenanigans, I would be like, oh, this card is needlessly bad. Like they just bullied this card into the ground. But because it's in yellow and because it's doing security nonsense, it's kind of necessary. Like,
yeah, and I think like that's where the idea on like, oh, maybe the level 5s needed to have some protection. Mastimon doesn't need it, but if they're able to stick their level 5s, maybe that would have made Mastimon more
yeah,
playable. And that's
Mm-hmm.
that's the contention point, is the fact that Mastimon's not playable because she herself doesn't have protection. Her removal is good, don't get me wrong, her removal's fine. It's just getting there is the hard part, because just using the old Mastimon is just easier because she just does more when you go into her.
hmm
Yeah, the ace is great and all. I'm not denying that at all. It's a mobile degrade that just says target any Digimon on the field and then minus your opponent's security.
Yeah, but
She's great and all, but she is too flimsy to actually sit.
yeah, but here's like going back to full circle, is the fact that like she's got great removal, but she doesn't have great protection, and because she doesn't have great protection, she's borderline
She's garbage.
unplayable. Yeah, because
yeah.
like you go up into a matchup where it's just like, oh, you see Magnamon X. Do you have an answer for Magnamon X as Mastimon?
Actually, yes.
You do only if they're swinging to trigger their protection.
Right,
Like
but they
that's
could
the
just
thought.
yeah, but they could just use like Zudomon, get rid of your sources, bounce your
Yeah,
level 5,
exactly.
and then you're
Right.
ruined. And then
Yep.
they also have the Magnamon also, where it's just like, cool, you played Gato, Digivolved into and Lady Devi or Anduamon. I'm just gonna Magnamon,
Oh,
strip your
it's
source,
body.
bounce it to your hand.
Yeah. Or
Yeah,
or
going that
you're
way,
in
you're
the
right
armor
on
vac
that.
and they go into like any of the rapids, and the rapids basically like freely out a level 5 Digimon because it's 6k body.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so like literally because there's no protection on the places that Mastimon needs protection, she just cannot function as a deck, and that's why she hasn't had any competitive success. Just as an example, on like in concept, she's
Outside of
really
Toolbox.
good, but in practice, she just is very falling behind and lacking. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of these decks on how they're able to do well, is the fact that like they need to have good protections and they need to have good removal. And if you don't, like, and this is all just free built in stuff too. Like, we're not talking about like adding any options or extra stuff to try to bolster what your deck is already deficient in. This is just what decks are doing built in for free for literally nothing at all. And that's the crazy part. And like where yes, I think like Digimon removal on Digimon bodies is a little on the strong side right now, and they kind of have to be because that's kind of where the game was headed, all the way back in like BT4, and we're only seeing a resurgence in options now because right now we're trying to pick apart into the chinks in the armor, so to speak, where it's just like, okay, I'm immune to Digimon effects. Well, shoot, all my removal is Digimon effects. Well, oh, but it's not immune to options or tamers. Got it. So I could use those types of effects to be able to out your Digimon because it's specifically stating Digimon effects. Just as an example, this is more in Tyrant's case. Because, like, Tyrant is a really strong deck, but he hasn't been doing so well because his damage output isn't threatening enough. Like, he has great protection, he has great DP boosting, he just doesn't have the speed to be able to keep up with the meta in order to, you know, actually survive.
Mm-hmm.
Which, speed is its own separate thing, because Green has a lot of tempo tools, but the fact that Tyrant still is able to top is most likely due to his protection giving him some really good matchups.
I honestly think, though, that, like, protection from just Digimon effects is, like, fairly balanced effect category to, like, that narrow group, I think is fine. Like, because the investment is already, like, really low in, like, Digimon-based removal, where, like, I already wanted to go into my Mega, it outing your board is a plus. Like, it's not the reason I am playing my guy. It's just, like, an extra bonus on top. Whereas, like, if you have things that are immune to options, and I'm deciding to play options, which, you know, is still decently rare in this card game right now, in this, like, meta landscape, like sure, people will probably try and argue with me that, oh, Heavens is in a lot of decks, or whatever, but you still had to make the active choice and play it, and it costs 7, and it never costs less than 7, unless you're hitting an ace.
Or you have, like, tamers to help reduce the cost, or
yeah,
just other
exactly.
ways to reduce the cost.
Right, but you had to, like, build towards that. Like, that's, like, quite the investment to, like, be like, oh, I'm gonna play, like, all of that 2-cost purple Mimi that, like, refunds you a memory when you play an option. Like...
That's only Secon levels of reducing, and that on its own is completely
Right, but
annoying.
what I'm saying, though, is that, like, it cost me 7 or 8 memory for most of the time to, like, play an actual option that, like, just about guarantee removes a body, right? Like, doesn't, like, you know, isn't one of the funnier ones that, like, sometimes doesn't do what I want it to do.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for a guarantee, like, always does it. Whereas, like, most Megas that always remove a body, and always remove, like, the guy that I want to remove, they cost, like, 4 to 3. And then they sometimes don't even cost that because I have a training or some other thing, like, or in Archetype I have a reduction mechanic. So, like, sometimes it costs me 1, and now I'm a big threatening body that my opponent now has to answer after I answered their entire board. Like,
that's honestly where the dual memory boosts that they're now releasing in the LM set in December actually are kind of necessary.
That's not in there.
Nice.
That's not in that one.
Really?
That's JP's just barely getting it. They're not giving it to us in December. We're getting LM like 3 and
it's LM2 through LM3.
Yeah.
Could have sworn that was in the LM3.
No. LM3 is the Ace Digimon, and it's the Scrambles.
Yep.
No. Well, still, either way, they're going in a nice direction in the form of those dual memories, or dual color memory.
It just seems weird. Like, they cherry-picked archetypes, like, and it's very evident because their characters are on the card art.
Yeah, like the Mastimon, the Imperial, Cherubi, Legend Arms.
Yeah, but
I don't remember the other two.
In terms of option space, the big problem on why we saw a reduction in option removal isn't necessarily 100% because Digimon removal was just that much more efficient, which that's a part of it. It's also because of those training cards and the memory boosts and scrambles, these like borderline game-defining staples that help make decks even function to begin with, especially when you're deficient, and they themselves have changed how deck ratios work in Digimon as a whole, is also what led to the reduction of removal options, because, hey, I only have this much room for options. Do I want to have it be a removal option, or do I want to have it be a consistency tool? Most players would rather just take the consistency tool because their Digimon usually would have built-in removal to it. So it's like, why do I need to run it?
Compounding. Exactly.
Yeah, it's a compounding issue.
And so that's kind of why, like, when we started to see these, like, guys that were just immune to, like, Digimon effects, I think that was fine. Like, I felt like, Bill from On Sleep was perfectly fine, because he only had it the one turn, and then for them to, like, do it again, they either had to have, like, another Rage in Trash and another Sleep in Hand to put on top of the Rage that, like, swung out, or you'd have to, like, do an entire, like, extra loop where you had to, like, play another, Ostamon and eat your rage mode to, like, go into a sleep or whatever. Like, it was a lot more, like, resource intensive than, like, what Magnamon is able to do, where it's like, oh, I just reapply the thing because I hit you in the face.
Or I took a card out of my security because I looked through it or something. Or
I activated the freaking option.
Yeah, and I think, like, some of the more rogue decks, like Ragnamon, that are doing well, because Ragnamon has more protections than just on his level 7. The Brywis, both the starter deck and the new one, also have their own built-in protection. And then if you have the new Raiji in it, like, there's more protection. So, like, you have compounding protections that are making it harder and harder to deal with the opponent's Digimon. And this is where, like, some of the removal types kind of just became entirely obsolete, because right now, just straight-up deletion is just bad. Like, there's so much protection against just deletion that, like, it's borderline useless as a removal type, which is unfortunate. Whereas, like I was saying earlier, Digivolve, I thought was really bad because back then, in the beginning of the game, we didn't have the removal that we do now to, one, deal with smaller bodies easier, and two, deck ratios were completely different. So yeah, I Digivolve your Digimon 1, paid 3 memory or whatever to do it, and you just go back up into it and nothing changed. Because deck ratios are a lot more slimmer now, that's actually harder to accomplish, which makes something like Digivolve more and more valuable as soft removal. Sure, it's not dealing with the actual body itself in terms of getting rid of it entirely, but the fact that it's good enough at just ruining the opponent's game plan is arguably more valuable at times, especially if your alternative option is to delete it when it either has an on-delete effect, which you don't want to trigger, or it just has deletion immunity because it just does. Which is why we see alternative forms of removal being, like, extra prominent, which is why Yellow's removal is, like, arguably the best in the entire game, because it's removal...
based on rules mechanics.
Yes, and it's the only removal type to do that, and now that they gave Yellow removal, which is already the strongest, sticky removal, so it even lingers, makes it that much more effective against a lot of decks that have temporary protections, because it falls off, and then boom, the Digimon is just instantly dead, without any input. And that's why, like, when I was playing Numemon and I was trying to understand Numemon and what was making it so good, most of the games that I was winning was literally because of Monzai X being as good as it is because of that lingering DP reduction. And most of the time, what I would end up doing is I would loop my Monzai X's, and then I just out their whole field, and they couldn't do anything, and now I'm sitting with a full field. And it's those types of positions where the opponent is sitting on nothing, you're sitting on everything. Where's the game going to go from here? Only one logical direction, unless something out of security just massively happens, which is not necessarily the case most of the time. It's like a good 5% chance if they're even running anything.
Monzemon X is a good show of, like, power creep. Like, as you were mentioning before, remember Lord Nightmon? Quite the meta threat. And Monzai X is just Lord Nightmon, but safer, because it evoes for free, on top of Monzemons and gives you the body right away without needing to attack.
Yeah, and then the body itself, if you're playing the Satsuki Rush Nume, also could just have Rush or set up your Tamer or whatever. Like, there's so much more you could do.
Play a bad 5-drop rookie that has Rush.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's just so much more that is able to be done now that really puts removal and protection in the forefront on how the game is warping and changing, because we saw stuff like raid start to be a little bit more prominently used in red in terms of red deck's success, because they have no other form of getting rid of threats.
Yeah, they had DP based deletion, so not like reducing DP, but we have thresholds and that triggers effects, or to do a delete, and that's just bad in the card game.
Right,
Yeah,
especially since like the level 4s that we're also working with are substantially stronger. So like, if you see a level 4 actually stick around on the field, that level 4 probably has already done something, or has protection, or is just big enough where they feel safe that they can leave this thing out. So, or they had no other option and they had to play it to enable something to begin with. Those are usually the three circumstances, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's often the case for, let's just go with Gallimon, for example, considering it's getting support in the next set. Often, the Gallimon player will just go on to their Black Garou just to try and see something. If they have enough memory, they will try to go for further, and try to go into like either Black War or the war that will play out a Takato or a Gyu. But ultimately, it's just trying to go off on certain things,
Yeah, well, this new Gallantmon is trying to be more defensive, and it's really silly on his protections because he only gets it during your turn, which means he wants to kind of be aggressive because that's the only opportunity you actually have for his protection. And then he also isn't affected by the opponent's effects, which is really good, but again, because it's during your turn, he wants to be aggressive, but they're giving him blocker. So like he wants to try to be defensive, but his previous iteration from BT12 was trying to use raid because, DP based deletion, and I think they understood DP based deletion, or like just deletion in general, was becoming less and less relevant, and like raid is how red is actually trying to kill things if you're trying to be a more control orientated red deck, which we can see with the ancient stuff, because the brand new ancient, even though he doesn't have raid, the level, what is it, the level 4 burning does have raid, so at least it could try to deal with Digimon that you might not otherwise be able to deal with otherwise. And especially since, like, it's easier to DP boost your Digimon, especially in a deck like Red Hybrids. So your level 4, that's ordinarily 6k with Raid, you could very easily make into, like, a 10 or even 12k with Raid, swinging into the opponent's Digimon, and that could efficiently deal with problems that the opponent might not have even thought was possible.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so, like, this is why... tucking to the bottom of the deck is pretty good because, again, bouncing and tucking... Yeah, bouncing and tucking, just, one, it's not filling up the trash, so there's a lot of trash-based strategies also. The trash is, like, this still very uninteractable zone. We're getting a little bit more cards that are interacting with it, but it's still, for the most part, relatively uninteractable.
I really don't like that it's, like, really just at, like, the level 7 spot.
Yeah.
Like, it's Merciful Mode, and it's the upcoming Imperial Fighter.
Yeah, outside of that, it's literally Black Gato, Uber, and that's basically it. That's all the trash interaction we have. So, like, that's why alternative forms of removal is, like, really good that's not filling up the trash, because it's denying the opponent that opportunity, whereas deletion-based stuff is also filling up the trash, which is enabling their strategy to begin with. So it, like, you could start to see these, like, compounding issues on how the game has evolved and the pacing and what's being good, on why it's being good because of some of these protections and removals that are being played against. And that's where the meta is starting to be defined by, because that's why Magnamon X, if you just don't have an answer to them, you kind of just are screwed. I was playing so much of the simulator, and I was just messing around with decks that weren't necessarily Magnamon X decks, and I threw Magnamon X in, and I was winning games I reasonably shouldn't have because the opponent's deck didn't have an out to it. And that's, like, the big rough spot, where it's just like, oh, we're going to see Shoto from EX7 paired up with Mother D-Reaper for a 15k free blocker that is literally untouchable outside of Raid. So it's just like, how are decks actually supposed to deal with this? And the answer is, for a lot of them, they can't. So the ones that can are the ones that are going to start standing out more and more. And then we see those Mother Shoto combos or these Magnamon X's, like, they are still in the meta relevancy, but they become on the lower end of the spectrum because we're now trying to play counters to that type of playstyle. And not everything has that protection, but because stuff does, it really changes how we have to approach Digimon and how, you know, the designers have to approach Digimon. Otherwise, you're going to run into situations like BT18 where you have this, like, slew of new cards, but the majority of them are not even relevant because do they answer Magnamon X? No. So, are they actually real decks? No. And the BT18 environment in Japan right now is mostly Numemon and Ancient Garurumon, mostly unchanged from BT17 because of everything that's currently being played and how much of a gap there is between their aggression, their speed, their removal, their tempo, just everything about what those decks are doing are just leaps and bounds above what others are doing, even though they don't have protections in of themselves half the time. They don't need it if they could just out the opponents.
I think there's, like, inherent issues, though, like, the blue color, like, itself, like, its form of removal is, as you, is the bounce to hand, which is already a very strong removal because it just ignores on deletes, it doesn't let things go to trash, like, all very good, but then it has the added issue of, like, its form of, like, aggression is unsuspends. And unsuspends are, like, way more dangerous than just straight up security attack, because I can have, like, 100 security attack, but 100 security attack doesn't let me win the card game if I can't swing again. Whereas, like, blue getting multiple checks from multiple legitimate swings, like, is a big difference.
Yeah, there's always going to be color discrepancies where certain colors, just from a fundamental level, are designed in balance compared to others. Like, I feel really bad for green because, like, green has been, like, the testing ground for red's mechanics, and on top of that, so, like, it's already doing what red is doing, just worse. Its core gimmick is speed and evolution, but, like, everything else is just as fast as it now because of the training cards and memory boosts and all that other fun shenanigans.
All of their actual good speed cards getting banned.
Right, but that was a huge mistake. But where was I going? Oh, right. So, like, there's already a huge discrepancy in the types of mechanics that certain colors are already working with, where it's just like, yes, blue is just red but better, and red is just green but better, making green one of the worst colors in the game, which is pretty unfortunate, because I know there's still a lot of good green stuff. And, like, you could kind of say, oh no, but Rapidmon's deck, you just literally talked about it twice, and we saw 2 Rapid decks, and it's like, yes, but those are actually playing off of yellow's mechanics, not off of green's mechanics. It's using the speed of green and the removal of yellow. So,
as well as they also got a ace card that skips levels.
Right. They also have an ace card which skips levels and can go on top of, its own level if you're in the right setup. So that way you have multiple points to threaten with, which is already annoying. But like one of the reasons, as we kind of were saying before earlier, is like in certain matchups, this is what is defining Digimon as more of a matchup heavy game in terms of like forming the rock paper scissors, because you get Rapid versus Mirage, and Mirage literally can't do anything to Rapid because all they have to do is hard drop a level 5. That level 5 has protection as long as you had the Tamer, and then you're just threatening an ace at that point, which is something that Mirage just functionally can't handle with because it's trying to be the deck that's outing others' protections rather than playing into its own protection. And those are kind of like the two categories of like deck spaces that we're kind of seeing form in the meta landscape. Is like the base and foundation is what's having the best protections, and then everything above that is what's able to out those protections to allow you to be a meta deck. And I think like right now, because the game is in like a huge transition point in terms of the understanding of that and how the meta landscape is shaping up, it's a lot more slim because there's a lot less answers for this new style of play. At least that's how I'm reading it. I could be completely wrong about that, but like Magnamon X probably isn't going to get banned because now they're probably making cards and strategies around the fact that Magnamon X exists. So, like, Magnamon X is probably going to be a floor point where it's just like, you have to be on his level or out him in order to actually be a viable deck. Which I think is pretty unfortunate of a floor to be in because, you know, it just eliminates a lot of fun shenanigans from happening. Like, I was playing Diaboromon, and I was getting into my level 6, and it was cool, but I wasn't removing any threats that the opponent was playing. So I was just literally sitting there. The opponent can do whatever the heck they want, and I'm just trying to be memory efficient to hope that they don't actually have an out to my play. And if they don't, I go off. And if they do, I kind of just lose. So that's like another example of like how certain decks are just completely invalidated by where the direction of the game is headed. And I'm not saying this is like a bad thing. It kind of is, I'm not going to lie, but it's just showing that they are figuring out how they want the dynamics and interactions of the game to change, and because you have to keep constantly trying to evolve the card game. Otherwise, you're going to hit stagnation, and then players get bored with stagnation. But in the same vein, right now, that's what we're seeing is stagnation, because nothing that they're making is outing this development shift.
Yeah, like we still see in the JP meta, Magna and Numamon are still top performing decks. And they are, at this point, what,
they would be probably in Japan.
3 or 4 products ahead of us right now?
Yeah, in Japan, it would be coming up to about like 6 or 8 months for them with this. If not almost that year mark. Which is crazy to think about. So, because like I was perusing the Reddits, and I saw somebody post like, hey, I'm trying to play Armadillomon, and I'm trying to play Cherubi Ace, or Cherubi Alliance. What, like, are these actually decks that are going to be viable continuing in the future? And my answer to that was no, because those decks aren't viable now. Granted, Shakamon / Armadillomon could be, because his level 5 does have good protection. It's in good colors to have good aces and access to Magnamon X, so it could be on the fringe side of viable. But in terms of where the shift in the development of the game is heading, it really doesn't have that much staying power, especially if you're not playing it that specific way, which, again, if you're playing a Magnamon X deck, you might as well just play the Magnamon X deck. Like, there's just no real reason to do it other than you just like Armadillomon and find his DNA engine funny.
They also got some of the core support, where their level 4s are really bad.
I actually have an appreciation for Inkilomon. Like, Inkilimon off of partition against somebody that's actually trying to aggress is very obnoxious.
Okay.
Granted, the Angemon's the bad
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
But Inkilemon's at least okay. Because, like, ideally, if you're building the Armadillomon armor deck, like, or Armadillomon Magnamon deck, your other level 4s are the armor level 4s.
He did get the funny thing, right, where he's yellow-black, right? And the
Yeah.
Angemon, for some reason, is blue-yellow.
Yeah, because the old one's
They
blue-yellow.
wanted to support a little bit of the old guy, but, like, not really. So, like, the fact that, like, you have an archetype guy that's just both colors does mean that, like, that deck has slightly better legs. Whereas, like, Sophimon's family doesn't have that many of those ones. Like, you can keep playing, like, the armor guys, like Harpy or Lynx. But Lynx is kind of bad, because it armor evolves on top of a champion, which makes it a little wonky. And Harpymon's fine, but, like, there just isn't enough, like, Hawkmons where you can just be like, oh, let's ignore Salamon. So sometimes it's got an evo for that whole 3 cost, and that's kind of rough in this current landscape.
Yeah, but as I was, like, getting to the point on the Reddit post, like, no, these decks aren't viable. There's realistically only 6 viable decks, and the person's just like, okay, so my answer is just play Numemon if I want a deck that's supposedly going to last all the way up until BT 18. And, like, in short, the answer is kind of yes, but the answer also is like, no, these 6 decks are what's going to be forming the rest of the meta through BT 18. And obviously there's going to be a couple of matchup changes here and there, based on the new stuff that's coming out in each subsequent set. But for the most part, the 6 meta viable decks that we have, Mirage, Imperial, well, Mirage kind of gets replaced with Ancient, so, like, Mirage starts to fall off just because Ancient is doing the same thing but better. But basically, like, the Mirage role, the Numemon role, Imperial, Demon Lords, and both Magnamon decks, like, that is the foundation of what is meta viable between now and BT 18. And I think that's, like, wild that, like, each set basically was its own mini rotation, and now that rotation is basically broken because of the meta dynamics of these decks in interaction with each other, on top of interaction with all of the other decks just not able to handle what these 6 decks are capable of. So, but yeah, I'm not saying, like, Digimon's in a rough spot because of this. Obviously, there's a lot of talk in the communities and contention that we really need a ban and restriction list, and I'm in wholehearted agreement with that. And we're about due for one, because Digimon usually has, like, an unofficially scheduled one in the summer-fall time, like, basically post-Gen Con. And then they also do one at the winter-springtime, which is around Nationals. So we kind of are due for one, and I kind of hope that we get one soon. I think realistically when they're going to do it is probably for... EX7 comes out before BT 18, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so most likely they're probably going to do it for EX7. They're going to look and see how bad it is in Japan for BT 18 before they do anything. So Japan's going to suffer through whatever BT 18 is. Whether it's fun or not is to actually be determined. I don't know. I'm not playing in it yet. But I think realistically around EX7 for us is when we most likely would get something. And I don't even know if that something, depending on what they hit, would actually be good enough, because, like, sure, they could remove Numemon from the equation, but then you still have Magnamon, and he's still the floor. Like, they're not going to hit him, unfortunately, because he's a secret rare, and they haven't hit a secret rare outside of Apocalypse, because Apocalypse just was not fun, period. At least, like, with Magnamon, there's still ability to play around him, which is, like, the unfortunate thing, because he's basically shaping how the meta is around his protection and his speed.
I honestly don't think it would be fine. Like, sure, it's gonna be rough. Like, I invested in the deck too. Like, sure, it'll suck. Like that, it'll have no value if they hit it. But they already moved their product. Like, it's not like a Pokemon where they knew like what a massive mistake he was, and they were willing to announce that and basically ruin the sales of BT15.
Yeah.
Like, BT16's already been sold. Like, everybody bought the product that they were gonna buy. Like, all those cards are just about all out there. Like, sure, it was a set that, again, like, had bad allocations or whatever, but, like, Bandai's done. They don't care. Like, doesn't care about the secondary market. Like, the most they look at it is, are our cards holding some monochrome of value so that we can sit at the big kids table with the other card games? Cool. But otherwise, they don't care.
No, because most of the time their reprints are targeted towards playable cards, which is usually a good thing. It's just the reprints also need to be coming out timely, which is the part that they struggle with.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we'll eventually get into ban and restriction thoughts. I'm just kind of putting it off because I want to kind of wait and see, kind of like what Bandai's doing, just how things are developing and if they are able to develop past what we currently have. And like that's kind of where a lot of this this kind of discussion was formed, was like, oh, obviously removal changes based on protections set the standard to what is playable, and deck ratios and other staple generic cards, which are very dangerous for the game, but Bandai really wanted to start pushing them, how they impact the overall pacing and tempo of the game. Like, those are the three major elements that are in play to shape and change how the game is made, and if Bandai doesn't understand the dynamic between those three elements, then that's gonna make things even more rough. Is like, that's why I like thought BT13 was such a home run, is because it actually felt like the design team understood the current state of the game the best, and kind of I'm just gonna say it, I think literally all of Block 3 was so far a ginormous mistake. Like, everything that they've done was incredibly game warping and game damagingly stupid. And sure, you could take that as negative as you want, but I think they tried something and it didn't work out and they didn't know how to fix it. That's kind of what this whole thing feels like to me.
A lot of it is like echoing back, and like there's big ramifications. Like, they changed up how like box ratios worked in the supers, and that like ruined market values in secondary market. So the card game just like got more expensive, and then it got artificially more expensive because of poor allocation and Bandai like being bad about printing, and that's a continuing compounding issue as they decide that they want more and more card game money, but don't actually want to be good stewards for their card games.
Yeah, so Bandai's got a lot of learning to do.
Like, we still haven't seen them print Union Arena yet in NA. What is that going to do to all the other card games when they have to start using their printers to print that card game too?
Especially when they're already forcing certain TOs to run specific other games, which they already don't want to run. I'm looking at you, Battle Spirits. And some stores also don't want to run Dragon Ball, but they're being forced to run Dragon Ball also. Right. So, like, Bandai is very controlling over a lot of their games in terms of stores and what they're able to do on a more competitive aspect to support the competitive community. And I know, granted, the competitive community is usually a smaller portion, but we're the more vocal portion that actually has the better understanding over their game than Bandai does themselves.
Well, if they didn't care about a competitive scene, they wouldn't throw us events, and they wouldn't have a ban list. Like, at that point, if this was supposed to be a casual card game, don't even ban cards. Like, who cares that you guys mess up? Like, if it's a casual card game, like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's the same way that, like, I'm like, unless it's like specifically things that are like super anti-fun, like MTG has like cards that were just designed to be dumb. Like, and Commander was like, oh, we'll hit those cards, but we're a casual card game, like format, so we're not gonna do lots of banned, even if the community is crying for cards to get banned.
That's a very fair point. It's funny. Speaking of MTG, their most curated format is Pauper. Fun fact.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
which is wild to me, considering Pioneer and Modern are like arguably their most competitive and more.
Modern is such a crazy mess, though.
Well, that's because they keep breaking it every time.
Yeah.
And like, I'm not saying Digimon's no better, because like obviously they printed Magnamon and that was like, and Apocalypse, like they very clearly make these ginormous mistakes and then they just are trying to cover their butts, because like I honestly think that like Bandai is used to doing solution selling, so they'll create a problem in one set and sell it 1 to 2 sets later. So probably the answer to what Apocalypse was supposed to be Imperial Dramon Fighter mode, but you know, Apocalypse was just that bad to where they weren't able to sell the solution exactly right away, because it was designed 2 sets late, or technically 2.5 sets later.
There's also just a fundamental misunderstanding that they have. Like, so they put together an archetype and they made a boss monster and they decided he was going to be generic. And they were like, surely nobody would play it with like crazy cards that like make it busted. Like, they would just play it in the archetype we built.
Yeah, and that might have been like the old designer's fault, where he just like, or they, I don't know their actual gender, but they could have just had this complete design oversight on a lot of things, and that's why like every single time they print like this hyper generic card like Shoto, like it just makes you stop and think like, why? Like, this game is an archetype based game. We're not like a Magic the Game where you should be encouraged to try to find like crazy stupid stuff. It's like, no, Bandai wants to give us enough tools for a specific archetype to make it playable, because they want to sell us decks.
To be fair, I do miss when you were less restricted by archetypes and you could like play more stuff. Like, the problem is that like even those kinds of decks like are a little just too high rolly. Like, they're not consistent because you don't have like actual searchers and like mechanics that are truly supporting each other. So like you're just kind of relying on dumb luck sometimes, which I think is kind of dumb.
I mean,
But
but
like,
we still get like cool and unique tools and interactions that other decks could abuse that you generally wouldn't think of. So like I was experimenting with a locals guy, Shakamon, and I found a funny interaction with Lunamon based on what I was observing from his gameplay, where he was just sitting on a level 5 that he wanted in his hand to be able to reuse. So he could have had Lunamon bounce it back, or he needed extra memory because he had a memory setter and your crosses cost 5 when you cross.
Mm-hmm.
So you could literally raise out Lunamon, bounce itself, gain the extra memory, and then cross into your Digimon and then go into whatever afterward. So like, you still do get some like off-brand experimentation, but usually that's because the packages aren't necessarily complete enough to fully flesh out the deck the way Bandai might think of it as.
mm-hmm.
And that's the fun.
Yeah.
That's where the real fun in Digimon is, in my opinion, is just that level of experimentation on figuring out what is even possible with the tools that the deck is able to run based on its own engine that it needs to run.
Like Magnamon X, they made it armor form, and that's legacy, right? Like, that's how all of the Magnets worked before, because they were the top end to like Armor Rush.
Yep.
Like, and it wasn't a problem there because of colors and it just not being like that good. Like, realistically, what would you gain from being able to play the golden Rapidmon and the old Magnamon BT-8? Like, guys that cared about armor form, nothing. Like, you were gaining a little bit of DP and an unsuspend. Cool. Gee, sure is great. But now it's like, oh, you gain a like mega boss monster that just can't get touched.
Yeah, and I think like legacy support is fine as long as it's treated with enough care, and they obviously have not treated it with enough care for a lot of the stuff. Like there's obviously some like egregiously dumb like legacy support cards or just open-ended cards that should be limited, and we all think that they should be limited, and then Bandai's just like, no, that let's make it generic, and then it breaks half the game because oopsies. I guess it's creating interactions it shouldn't have.
It's obvious, like, that it wasn't supposed to be a piece for Armor Form decks. It was supposed to just be a piece for, like, Magnamon decks. So I don't know why it wasn't just, like, old X antibodies where it's like, oh, I do the cool thing if I have the little one under me.
Yeah. I don't know. That's Bandai. We'll eventually have another episode about this. There's so many episode ideas where X Antibody is just absolutely broken every single time that they try to do anything with it. It literally comes out one of two ends, which is the same as alternate win conditions, which is either complete butt and do nothing, or the best thing since sliced bread.
To be honest, though, they always improve a deck. Like, very rarely does a deck get an X Antibody anything form, and it's a bad card. Like, it's still always good just because putting it on top of a guy and just getting a free extra draw to, like, find an actually good piece is still always good.
Yeah. But, I know we got a little bit off topic, so we're probably just gonna wrap things up here. I think Digimon is definitely in a transition point in terms of its design. I think based on the level of protections and removals that we have, it's definitely going to create harder matchups, and if they're not creating cards to accommodate these harder matchup situations, then that's going to be what's making the game more difficult in terms of like having cards actually have an impact on where the meta currently is. And well,
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, I think that we do need, though, more options that are good in hand but bad in security. Like, I think that's like, everyone can complain about Heaven's Judgment and be like, oh, it's a card that does like minus 24k and wipes my entire board, but it does that in hand and it costs them 7. Whereas out of security, it hits minus 12k, and that's not good enough in this card game anymore. Like, most guys survive 12k neg.
Yeah.
And I think that's fair and balanced. Like, I think the old design space of very impactful, like, option cards that do, like, single remover or this or that, but also do it out of security, bad for the game.
Yeah. That's where, like, supporting security control is just a big mistake, because part of, like, what made security control, not to try to get into another tangent, so strong is because it was working with some of the best removal options in the game, abusing the security system to its benefits to try to bypass the opponent's protections as best as they possibly can. And right now, security control isn't really being played because the protections are too good even for it. And the amount of, like, aggression is also just too much for security control to even think about handling. And that's why security control is going to be changing as the protections change, and it's up to the players to see if the removals and color combinations that they could come up with is good enough for the game. And right now, it currently isn't, because the protections are too high, and they can't bypass them.
To be fair, they kind of can, because a lot of where the protections are happening is on opponent's turn. So, like, you can't do the from hand option as regularly, but, like, them checking in security still kills them. Like, Ragnalord doesn't only has protection the turn it gets made.
Yeah, but Ragnalord also has inheritables that say security effects don't happen.
Yeah, if you're playing Old Durand, right? But I think that topping list wasn't playing Old Durand. I think they were only playing New Durand.
No, the new one has it too.
No, does the new one have it?
Yeah.
I know he gives, like, piercing, but what else did he give? I thought he... Because I know that they're kind of, like, they're different. Like, so, because the old Brywind gives, like, generic flat, your opponent doesn't affect you protection. but the new guy gives blocker and like something kind of similar, but like I thought it was slightly weaker.
No, the new Duran states, while this Digimon is Ragnarlord Mon, it doesn't activate security effects.
Okay. Then yeah, then that's fine. Like that's good for him, but like but what I was gonna say is like for like Magna, like right? Like unless you put in the extra effort to touch your own security, like, you know, you can still get hit by a sec bomb, like, and that's true for like a couple other guys, right? Like Tyrant is just not immune to options, so like that's his big fear is hitting sec bombs. So like there's still a place for it, but like I think that's the problem is that like that strategy is already degenerate and like an abuse of removal and an entire mechanic of the game being how security effects work.
Yeah, it's
that, like I said,
yeah.
If we had strong in-hand options but slightly like weaker or lesser effects in security, I think like that would be a decent balancing point for removal. Like if we can get away from Digimon with like blanket protection and just move back to like protecting myself for opponent's Digimon effects, as we can kind of try and pare down like Digimon removal.
Yeah, the problem is though they've already opened up Pandora's box, and once that box is opened, there's no shutting it. So we're like the level of protection is only going to get worse from here, unfortunately, unless they actually, as stupid as this sounds, unless they actually take the best advice ever and to just not do the same mistake again. Like it, as much as stupid as that sounds, it honestly is like the best answer I could give is like that was a mistake, just don't do it again. And then they keep doing the same mistake again, and it's just like, what? Whatever. I tried. I can only do so much as to... Because all they literally have to do is just not print that same level of protection on a lot of things. And what are they doing? Printing that same level of protection on more things. And that's not the answer. That's only making the problem worse.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, as much as I would like them not to... they already opened up that box, and they are very not closing it, which is unfortunate. But yeah, so I think this episode was pretty good. A lot of different topics, slightly off topic, but all good discussions nonetheless. I know this was a longer episode, but that's just because there was a metric butt ton of metadata to go over, and I've been calculating all of the metadata for BT16 and for EX6. I've been doing it separately. I could create a combined version just to see where it's at. I don't necessarily think that's needed. But yeah, so if you enjoyed this episode and you made it all the way to the end, please make sure to share it with others on social media. And I want to take this time to thank everyone for watching, and we will see you later.